We are up and running, and it is a beautiful, beautiful day in the Midwest. Autumn is making its approach, and pumpkins are getting plump, and apples are crisp on the tree. And out in California, it's windy and weird, right, Stephen?
Yeah, it's always fluctuating here on the mountain. We get totally different weather within the same day. So it can be windy and cold in the morning and night, and then it's sunny and warm throughout the day. So oftentimes I'll have to change into my shorts just to adjust and then change back in my pants.
Oh, well, that at least keeps you occupied. So, oh, and I wanted to say Shana Tova.
What was that? I'm sorry.
I said I wanted to say Shana Tova as we started off our dialogue here.
Is that's from the holiday that was yesterday?
Yes, that is Happy New Year.
Ah.
Shana Tova.
Well, Shana Tova.
Yes, and this is the Jewish year 5777, which has got me dancing all over the place. Because if you take those three sevens and combine them, you have 21. And if you add 21 and 5, you have 26. And 6 and 2 are 8. And 8 is an extremely auspicious number. So this is an auspicious year by the Jewish calendar.
That's really interesting because I'm turning 26 this month.
Oh,
and my birthday is on the 26th of October.
So it's all over the place. We have no other alternative other than to have a great year opening up for us.
Yeah, and also the 13 and 13, right?
Right, exactly. And it's part of the celebration of the Jewish New Year is that the apple harvest has come in, and they have harvested also the nectar of the bees. So you have honey and apples, and part of the celebration of New Year's is to take a slice of apple, and dip it in honey, and salute the richness and the texture and the joy and the beauty of life.
It must be why Lorian felt the compulsion to make apple cobbler last night.
There you go. Tell her in the future to make sure she adds a little honey, because that makes an apple really happy, is when you drench it in honey.
Excellent. Well, we have honey here, so we could just add some in there probably.
There you go. Well, we have advanced here to lesson number 43. God is my source. I cannot see apart from him. And I'll let you lead us into this dialogue.
Sure. Well, I love the first line of this. It says, perception is not an attribute of God. And then it goes on to say, his is the realm of knowledge, yet he has created the Holy Spirit as the mediator between perception and knowledge. Without this link with God, perception would have replaced knowledge forever in your minds. With this link with God, perception will become so changed and purified that it will lead to knowledge. That is its function as the Holy Spirit sees it. Therefore, that is its function in truth. So the entire purpose of perceiving in this realm of existence is to let the Holy Spirit transform that perspective back into knowledge, which is all it, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
But we're going to start off with this first line, because this first line is very, very profound in itself. Mm-hmm. Perception is not an attribute of God. In other words, there is nothing outside of God for God to perceive. So that's the salient point right off the bat that we have to stop and look at. Now, if we are within God and fully awake within God, we lose perception. Nothing is objectified in our realm. But in this world that we have created, everything is objectified outside of us. So this beginning is starting to help us understand that the objectified world is not real, it is an illusion. And the true world, which is the realm of knowledge, the knowingness of everything that is within, the totality of God, is really our only real experience. That's the only real truth to living, to being.
Yeah, and it's like that Carl Jung quote, right? That who looks outside sleeps, and then who looks within awakens.
Absolutely, yeah. And Carl very much was a fellow who held on to an acceptance of the mystical experience, the mystical journey. So all of his efforts were invested in trying to validate the metaphysical, the spiritual life that we are living. And that would help us to understand what the physical world that we're experiencing was being generated from.
Yeah, and this line in the lesson, I cannot see apart from him being God. I mean, wouldn't you say that line is saying, well, God is that first cause, he's that first source. So if we're not living in our awareness of that, well, even if whether we are or not, we can't even perceive outside of God.
Right. In other words, we have to imagine ourselves to be outside of God, which is technically impossible, but we've done a bang-up job of creating that illusion of being outside of God. But once we are fully restored, there is no distinction between the effect or the child and the causation, which is God. In other words, our relationship is so intimate with God that there is no distinction between the creator and the created. And that in itself is a source of joy for those who are starting to recognize where the real value in life is.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that lesson?
Not really. I think that it's a lesson that has a lot of different fine points that you really have to stop and contemplate. And so it's not a lesson to just, read through briefly once during the day. I think you do need to stop and ponder it periodically throughout the day. Because as we slide down here to that fifth paragraph, he comes up with, I see through the eyes of forgiveness. I see the world as blessed. The world can show me myself. I see my own thoughts, which are like God's. So we really are being challenged to think with God rather than to have our private thoughts, which is what is creating the illusion of all the chaos in the world. And as soon as we get back on track and ask for the restoration of vision, ask to see the world through the eyes of Jesus, then we're actually having an impact. So if you're out there on a picket line, if you're an activist, if you're saving a whale or stopping a pipeline or whatever, those are all worthy causes. But the reality is we've had worthy causes from the advent of this realm, from time immemorial. And ultimately, every time you fix something, or it appears to be fixed in the material world, the truth is that something else wobbles off course. So we create these endless preoccupations that keep us consumed. And really, the real job, the real effort has to be in each individual opening themselves up to that reunification with God, and to be able to see the world through forgiving eyes, and to be able to see beyond the chaos and to recognize the presence and the activity of Jesus in every person that we encounter.
Well said. And it's like that's how we're aligning ourselves back with our source. Correct.
Absolutely, yes. And the final in lesson 44, as far as our affirmations we're making, is God is my source. I cannot see apart from him. So we're reinforcing that idea that if you are seeing something that is not perfection, that is not divine, then you are trying to see on your own, and you're not allowing God's vision to come through to you, to illuminate you, to give you a release from all the suffering that this world appears to contain.
Yeah, absolutely. It froze up there for a moment. Did you already go into lesson 44?
Not yet. We are at lesson 44.
Okay, lesson 44. God is the light in which I see. Did you want to start off with that, Chris?
Sure. Today we are continuing the idea for yesterday, adding another dimension to it, and this I really like, because this getting rid of the ego is like peeling the onion, shedding layer after layer after layer until finally you come to the core and there's nothing there. So this layer that we're working on is stepping away from this idea that we are actually living on a planet that gets a little bit of sunlight for 12 hours a day in its mad journey around the sun. But the universe itself is filled with black emptiness, eternal night. And this is repudiating that idea. God is the light in which I see. And this gives us the suggestion that when we awaken, the universe we occupy is filled with light rather than darkness. And that's an interesting concept, and one that I have had personal experience with. So I'll tell you that you can step into that realm and experience a universe that is filled with varying degrees of light that are so bright and brilliant and pure that it becomes almost impossible to describe the experience. But it says, today we are continuing the idea for yesterday. Skipping forward, you can make darkness and then think you see in it. See, yes, we made the darkness, and then we, have our little lamps and have our little sunlight episodes. But he says, but light reflects life and is therefore an aspect of creation. So in creation, in life, everything is light. Creation and darkness cannot coexist, but light and life must go together, being but different aspects of creation. So when we're here in this realm, we're actually living in the belief of death, and that's reinforced over and over and over again. In order for you to survive, you have to kill something and consume it to stay alive. Whereas in truth mode, we are the givers of life, not the consumers of life. So a lot of different levels of thought can be experienced in this particular lesson. So the light is within, not without. This next section is really cool because you can get yourself to that point where you are able to experience that illumination. Says, today we are going to attempt to reach that light. For this purpose, we will use a form of exercise which has been suggested before and which we will utilize increasingly. It is a particularly difficult form for the undisciplined mind and represents a major goal of mind training. And that's what the Course is. It's, basically reclaiming control over the mind. It requires precisely what the untrained mind lacks. Yet this training must be accomplished if you are to see. So then you have the practice periods that it speaks about. But it's kind of interesting that in order to see this world that is filled with light, you have to close your eyes. And this is the differentiation between sight and vision. As long as you're relying on sight and you think sight is the most important part of your life, you're missing truth. Because in order to enter truth, you have to baffle that part of the mind that relies on sight and open yourself up to vision. And I will say, you know, for people who are trying to attain this experience, it will come, and you have to be consistent. But the first experiences may be just a brief flicker, just a flash. But you will feel this breakthrough. You will feel this sense of release, this sense of finally attaining a sense of peace around whatever it was that was a problem for you. So that's why it's so very, very important to use these lessons consistently and to stay with the workbook on a day-by-day basis, because that's how we reclaim control over the mind and how we start to experience these little sparkles of the true light, which is where our life actually is unfolding.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Lesson 45 says that God is the mind with which I think. And let's see, I'll start with the first one. Today's idea holds the key to what your real thoughts are. They are nothing that you think, just as nothing that you think you see is related to vision in any way. There is no relationship between what is real and what you think is real. That seems to go along a lot with what you were saying, and how it's not what you see. What you see is not related to actual spiritual vision. And that vision is something opposite, other than what we see with our eyes. Wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
And this gets us back to the idea of experience as opposed to the intellectual side or analysis or observation. See, it says you think with the mind of God. Therefore, you share your thoughts with him, and he shares his with you. Now, do you think God is sitting around looking at, blisters on his feet and thinking about, the idiots running around in the street and all of this effluvia? Absolutely not. What God's thoughts are experiential, and that's why we're ceasing the activity of the mind, because as long as you're analyzing, as long as you're thinking, as long as you're in that mode of having a thought about something exterior to you, you are not experiencing. When you enter the silence and when you become comfortable with the silence, you start to have an experiential sort of process that begins to unfold, where you become the experience of love, you become the experience of peace, you become the experience of joy, you become the experience of abundance. And that is the distinction that we're all looking for in the way that we approach the Course, is we stop thinking about all this crap and we start experiencing it. And then once we do, it brings it forth, it manifests forth into this realm. A peaceful world. We see a more centered world. We experience a more abundant world because we have had that communion with God where his thoughts are shared with us.
Yeah, and it's helpful for me to remember that no matter what we see going on outside of us, we can always access that, since our mind is connected with God's, and God is the mind with which I think. We can always access that piece of who we are within the midst of what may appear to be very chaotic around us or threatening.
Exactly. Absolutely. It says we will, all the way down here in section 5, it says we will also try to understand that only what God would have us do is what we want to do. See, it's that desire to live in God that creates the experience of living in God.
Mhm.
And, you know, it goes on to say we'll also try to remember that we cannot fail in doing what he would have us do. So even if you don't succeed today, you will not fail in ultimately attaining these somewhat lofty goals that we have established for ourselves.
Absolutely. Do you want to read off lesson 46?
Okie dokie. Well, God is the love in which I forgive. And this is another beautiful concept that we constantly have to reinforce over and over and over, because it's so very, very easy for us to condemn. And as soon as we start that process of condemning others, we're condemning ourselves. And so we have the guilt, and then we feel the separation, and it just makes things worse and worse and worse. This one starts off with God does not forgive because he is never condemned. God is incapable of passing judgment because all he knows is the perfection of God. And there must be condemnation before forgiveness is necessary. Forgiveness is the great need of this world, but that is because it is a world of illusions. Are thus releasing themselves from illusions, while those who withhold forgiveness are binding themselves to them. As you condemn only yourself, so do you forgive only yourself. So that is pretty potent when you really stop and look at it. That makes it an inescapable circumstance. As long as you're condemning, as long as you're judging, as long as you're holding, you know, some kind of a judgment against another person or in a situation, then you have removed yourself from forgiveness for yourself. It's not that God is not willing to forgive you. It's that you are in a position where you are rejecting God's mercy and forgiveness because you are standing apart. You are standing outside the kingdom of heaven.
I want to bring up, I've heard this line before that there's nothing to really forgive, right? Because there's nothing, whatever illusion that we believed in didn't really ever have validity in the first place. So what would you say to that kind of idea that there's nothing to forgive in truth?
Well, that's something that you arrive at as you penetrate these different levels, these different layers of illusion. Because you can be, you know, flippant about it and just say, oh, there's nothing to forgive, yada, 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 and move on. And that really isn't doing the work. That is simply muttering a platitude and then trying to ignore something that's going to eventually come back and haunt you. What we have to do is we have to see through the illusion, see through the veil. And that is a process that we cannot attain on our own. We have to surrender all of our judgments to that higher consciousness, to the Holy Spirit that is helping us by interceding on our behalf. So it is a very deep process. And it goes back to where we were in this last discussion we had a week ago, where we're surrendering our personal self to more and more be absorbed into the ego of Jesus so that we can see beyond the illusion. You know, Jesus hanging on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, is probably the most profound statement in human history. To be in that position and not to say, okay, God, come on down and kick their ass for me. That is, you know, that is pretty intense. And we see the horrors that the ego creates to try and convince us that death is real all around us. And we have to reach out and accept the assistance of the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Jesus in order to be able to let go of this stuff, because it is hideous. I mean, there is no getting away from the reality that the world we see in this mortal form is beyond belief. And the reason it's beyond belief is because it's not real. But it takes a lot of surrender to get your ego disentangled to the point where you can stop judging and stop condemning and stop defending and just living in a state of forgiveness and love.
And so what I'm hearing you say is like that forgiveness process is definitely an active process. There's no spiritual bypassing by just saying, oh, it's already done. Like there is a work involved. There is a process involved.
Yes. And well, it's the entire book, A Course in Miracles, is a book about disassembling the ego. And that's exactly what this is. We are disassembling me, myself. Look at me. All of my vain pursuits, all of my glory, you know, and again, putting a little bit of a humorous edge on it. Imagine that you were Donald Trump. Disassembling an ego like that has got to be a lifelong journey. But, you know, even the rest of us, our humble little egos here, are just as obnoxious, just as condemning, just as vicious, just as nasty as Donald says. And we can never forget that. We have to recognize and be committed to truly taking apart this identity that we have created so that the truth can finally come forth.
Absolutely. And we're all connected anyway. So lesson 47 says, God is the strength in which I trust. If you are trusting your own strength, you have every reason to be apprehensive, anxious, and fearful. What can you predict or control? What is there in you that can be counted on? What would give you the ability to be aware of all the facets of any problem and to resolve them in any way, in such a way that only good can come of it? What is there in you that gives you the recognition of the right solution and the guarantee that it will be accomplished? Of yourself, you can do none of these things. So that's a really, really beautiful beginning to start off with. You know, it's humbling, right? And a true surrender back into God, our source, and, you know, not my own strength I trust in, but in God's strength.
That is true. There's also kind of a scary part in this too, when we stop and look at it from the mundane level, which is that idea that we have to turn it over to God and let God resolve the problem. Let God become our strength. Because the ego comes up with this idea almost immediately of what I just mentioned, you know, well, they hung Jesus on a cross, so you're going to get crucified. And throughout the course, it's reiterated over and over again that if you are living in that place of trusting that God's strength is there for you, you will never be given a challenge that you are not ready to accommodate or to handle. So in other words, your path will be directed so that you will not end up on a cross somewhere. It may at times seem like that, but the truth of the matter is, by surrendering to the divine within us, since God is love, God doesn't want to take us through, you know, the bramble bushes and the rocky roads in order to get back to a place of reunion. So we have to trust that God's strength is with us, and we'll be shown repeatedly, or at least I have been in my life, that that's the only strength that actually works on my behalf. But we also have to be willing to confront the ego's blithering about, you know, you're doomed and the worst possible nightmare is going to be the outcome of this. It does require a little bit of, you know, steeling our nerves against some very fearful ideas that the ego will occasionally toss out to us.
Yeah, and so often the Course speaks about look at the ego's patterns and then offer it up to the Holy Spirit. So like really like looking at the fear and looking at the anxiety and all the things the ego brings up, like it's not real. It's really just, it's more of like a ploy that the ego is trying to trick us with, right? So it doesn't really have validity. Like in truth, like God has the best possible outcome planned for us.
Exactly. Yeah. The ego is brilliant at the scare tactic approach, and 99% of the time, these horrible things that we imagine as being the outcome of unpleasant events in our lives really don't work out that way at all. And if you go back and review, events in your own life, it's like, the things that you have been the most apprehensive about, once you have gone through it and come out on the other side, more often than not are like, well, what the hell was I so upset about? Yeah. And that's the way it works over and over.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And lesson 48 is led into really well with that, because it says there is nothing to fear.
Yeah, this is a beautiful, beautiful reaffirmation of the power of God's activity and presence in our lives. Because wherever God is and wherever we are acknowledging God, there is nothing to fear. And it says the idea for today simply states a fact. It is not a fact to those who believe in illusions. So, if you believe that the swamp creature is under your bed, then there's a pretty good chance that something's under your bed that's unpleasant. But illusions are not facts. In truth, there is nothing to fear. It is very easy to recognize this, but it is very difficult to recognize it for those who want illusions to be true. A very important statement here. The more you want to hold on to the illusionary world, the more that you reinforce the boogeyman in your life. So as soon as you're willing to let go of illusions and to live in love, then you'll find that all of those grisly monsters from the dawn of the dead start to literally evaporate in front of you.
Yeah, and as simple as that, it's like just like shining a light in a room, and eventually that darkness just, it, like you said, it evaporates.
It absolutely does. And the beauty of this is when you start working with these concepts, they start working with you. It is a proactive process. The more you put your attention on this, the more you use these simple affirmations, the more you will experience a release from those horrible, hideous things in your life that you think are happening to you. And you'll be able to make that passage, that journey through the desert, and always find the water supply, always find the nurturing that you need. So it is important to keep these things alive in your mind, because they are practical. They are not frou-frou stuff that just gets you into this airy-fairy mindset. And this is a guide for living in the material world.
Absolutely. And lesson 49 says, God's voice speaks to me all through the day. And I like how it starts here. It says, it is quite possible to listen to God's voice all day without interrupting your regular activities in any way. I just love that one part. You don't really have to stop anything you're doing. You don't have to like stop doing your laundry, or you don't have to like quit your day job or anything. It's just all you have to do is be willing to listen to God's voice that's speaking to you all through the day.
And actually, a lot of times it kicks in when you are fully engaged. Like if you are doing your laundry, if you're washing the dishes, you'll find yourself floating into that Zen state and experiencing the voice of God, that quietness, that sense of peace, that sense of loss of time. That's one of my favorite aspects of this, you're engaged in something. You've got the busy mind wound up doing what it's doing, and you're able to step back and just observe and to immerse yourself in that state of peace. As Jesus said, the peace that passeth understanding. And you can get these little tiny snippets of this all throughout the day. If you will become aware of that, then you can cultivate it. Then you can make it happen for longer periods and more frequently until finally your day is somewhat stress-free. And, you're stepping into a place of being at peace with the world you inhabit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And God's voice, for you, I don't know your experience with that, Chris, but like God's voice is very still, correct? It's a sense of peace. Is that correct?
It can show up as peace. It can show up as a sense of love.
Mm-hmm.
The ecstatic experience. You're just sitting there, and all of a sudden, that little portal opens a tiny, tiny degree, and you're just overwhelmed with this flood of love for no reason. And later in the day, you're going back and going, wow, that really felt good. I wonder what that was all about. So, it shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up in understanding. That's one of my favorite ways. I'll be looking at the circumstances around me and going, this makes no sense. This is like a freaking plate of spaghetti. And all of a sudden, this sense of understanding comes through. And you're able to sort it out. And you're able to look at it and say, this means nothing over here, and this over here is what I need to finish, resolving. So it can show up in a lot of different formats, but it's all that same quintessential experience of having that direct contact with God.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Which brings us to our final lesson for today, which is lesson 50. Do you want to read it off, Chris?
Absolutely. This is a great way to wind up today's discussion. It says, I am sustained by the love of God. And this is going back to that idea of here in this mortal world, we're sustained by death and destruction. In truth, when we get to that more awakened and enlightened state, we recognize that love is our sustenance. Here is the answer to every problem that will confront you today and tomorrow and throughout time. In this world, you believe you are sustained by everything but God. Your faith is placed in the most trivial and insane symbols: pills, money, protective clothing, influence, prestige, being liked, knowing the right people, and an endless list of forms of nothingness that you endow with magical powers. So, and this is why occasionally when I see people getting too fixated on stones and crystals and things like this, I try to redirect them to the recognition that use the crystal, use the stone as a reminder of the presence of God's love, because that's all that's going to sustain you. Get beyond that idea of imagining that these stones have power, because the power you imagine may show up briefly, but then there's going to be extended periods when that power is going to be absent. So you're going to fall back down again. So use whatever your little magical symbols are as simply reminders, ways to reference back to the idea that God is what sustains you and nothing else. And that's really, again, a major part of the course is single-mindedness. You can't have things in competition to God. It has to always go back over and over and over again to that acknowledgement that the source of power in any realm is God. And as soon as you diminish that or try to disconnect from that, you will reap the unfortunate rewards of that. So get beyond your little magical stones and your little magical tricks and affirm that God's power is your birthright and that you were born with it, and as soon as you turn on the switch, it's there for you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It continues here. All these things are your replacements for the love of God. All these things are cherished to ensure a body identification. They are songs of praise to the ego. Do not put your faith in the worthless. It will not sustain you. Only the love of God will protect you in all circumstances. And that's pretty much been my experience in 70 years of blundering around on the planet. I have gone through all those different pursuits and have come to that recognition and acceptance that the powers of the material world are illusory. The power of God is a sustainable and ongoing source of triumph over our, silliness that we're having to deal with.
And so, like, even though it might be hard for us to fully believe at times, like even the things that we endow with magical properties, like, pills or anything like that, like in reality, they don't have those properties. Is that the idea there? Like that we're basically associating those properties with them?
Well, you're basically giving them those properties. So, if you imagine that a leave pill that you take is going to relieve all the body aches, it will work for 6 or 8 or 10 hours, but it has its limitations. But if you start to slowly step away from that and slowly start to work on recognizing the power of God and surrendering your pain, your sorrow, your frustration, your blockage, and asking for understanding, then you will start to actually experience the healings that are a part of A Course in Miracles.
Yeah, I can actually vouch for that statement from having been on, medication, antidepressant, and, things like that for anxiety or whatnot. And having got off those things and, not experiencing those symptoms anymore. And I do really attribute that to this path onto divinity that I've been on.
Yeah, it absolutely works. And, you can see where a lot of people get a little too carried away with this and say, taking my heart medication right now. And, then they have a stroke or a heart attack or something. You have to build your belief in this, because everything is a product of belief. First, experience it by having, the awareness come to you. You get the idea. Then you invest faith into that idea. Faith will become belief, and belief will become reality. So this is not a journey of jumping off a cliff and saying, "Save me, God." That's not at all the point here. This is a journey of building your belief system into God, rather than relying on all these mortal things that ultimately fizzle out. Because you can take your heart medication for 28 years, but eventually there's probably going to be come a time when that medication won't work and you'll croak. What we're wanting to do is to encounter death in an awakened way. And, death is never the answer. Death is never the resolution. So to consciously step out of the body is what the ultimate goal is. That's what Yogananda taught us. That's what Christ taught us. That's what Buddha taught us. Every great spiritual voice throughout time has taught us that we have the capacity to remain awake, to remain alive, and to be able to transcend this physical body, this physical form. And that's what we're all ultimately working to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And using it again as a communication device, right? For a while,
exactly.
It appears to be here.
Right. We normally use it as defense and attack. And ultimately what we're coming back to realize is that the only thing that the body is to be used for is communication. And what is communication? It's the exchange of love, because there is no other valid communication.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And so that doesn't need to have words in any way, shape, or form. It can take the form of words, but it doesn't have to.
Absolutely, yes.
Beautiful.
So the words lead us again into the experience. So you start off with loving words, but then you enter the silence. And for those people who are looking for community, this is why I often recommend the Quakers. You go to a Quaker meeting, you walk in, you sit down, and you experience the silence, like some mega church where they've got trumpets blaring and organs going off and all this noise and shouting and talking. You walk in and everybody's just sitting there and they're quiet. They're experiencing that union that we can find in just being quiet. So check out the Quakers. They've got some good stuff going.
Lovely. Yeah. And if we're just at home by ourselves, we can also just meditate and do these workbook lessons with us.
Absolutely. Well, Stephen, this was kind of a fun romp through the next week of lessons, and hopefully we'll have a few people that will check out the video that we are creating here. We do ask that if you like what you're hearing, please do share it with people and subscribe to the channels that you're seeing it posted on, and give us a little support by helping us put the word out so that all of us can awaken to a much happier day.
Yeah, and feel free to leave comments or questions as well on the video, or you can message us too if it's something you'd like to share more privately.
Absolutely. Well, Stephen,
okay.
You need to go out and stand in the wind on the mountain.
Yep, that's what I need to be doing. It looks like it's calmed down a bit out there, though. So, yeah, I really enjoyed doing this with you, and I'm happy to pick up again next week.
Yes, and once again, Happy New Year, 5777. Those are magical numbers, but you have to stop and take it back to God and realize God's the only power behind those numbers.
Absolutely. I'll keep remembering to do that. Well, you have a great week, Chris, and I'll talk to you next week then.
Great. Take care.
All right. Take care.
Bye.